They say time heals all wounds, but there are some scars that time simply learns to hide better. When Alina Vance stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Riverview Chapel that morning, it wasn't just the weight of the past she carried. It was also the weight of eyes, dozens of them, watching, whispering, judging. They hadn't seen her in over a decade. Most assumed she wouldn't show up at all. And certainly not to the funeral of the man who had once stood beside her at an altar, hands trembling with vows of forever. The room was quiet, but the silence was anything but empty. It was loaded with tension, with gossip, with disbelief. Alina didn't flinch. Her coat was simple, navy blue, lined with a faint pattern of tiny stitched leaves. Her scarf was tucked neatly at her collar, not a hair out of place. If she was nervous, it didn't show. If she was grieving, it wasn't for the man in the casket. She moved to a seat near the back, her hands resting in her lap, as a few heads slowly turned back to the front, pretending to focus on the large framed photo of Gregory Vance, surrounded by white lilies. Gregory had been a man of presence, tall, articulate, always at ease in a crowd. In his prime, he ran a regional architecture firm, designed city halls and corporate campuses, and gave to all the right charities. He had been married twice. Alina was the first. They were young when they met, not quite reckless but certainly ambitious. Alina, a teacher, Gregory, a freshly minted architect with a vision and a plan. Their lives intertwined quickly, dinners turned into weekends, weekends into shared bills, and then a wedding under a sky of uncertain stars. The years together had been quiet, not unkind, not cruel, but something more haunting than that. They were polite years, silent years, years that pass without incident and yet leave behind the feeling of having lost something vital you can't name. But that part of the story hadn't mattered to anyone else. What they remembered was how he had moved on, married someone younger, flashier, a woman who wore her heels like armor and always arrived with a statement purse. They had 2 children together. And Alina, like an old chapter, was quietly folded away. Now here she was, unfolded. A murmur rose from the front. The minister had begun his speech, words of legacy, of kindness, of family. A few sniffles broke the hush. And still, Alina sat perfectly still. Her eyes were not on the casket, but on the tall man standing to the side, holding a sleek black folder. The lawyer, she didn't know his name. Only that he was from Tannen and Ries, Gregory's firm for the last 2 decades. The service moved swiftly. Speeches, scripture, a song played softly through an unseen speaker. And then the lawyer stepped forward. "If I may," he said gently, "Gregory requested that I read the following portion of his will publicly at the conclusion of the service." Chairs shifted, there was a ripple of curiosity. This wasn't typical. He opened the folder. "To my wife Evelyn, I leave our home, the lake house, and the remainder of the joint accounts established during our marriage. To my children, Charlotte and Henry, I leave the education trusts and investment portfolios arranged in their names." A pause. "And to Alina Vance." The name landed like thunder. Several heads turned. Even Evelyn, seated in the front row in a tasteful black dress, sat up straighter. "To Alina Vance, I leave the property located at 119 Crescent Lane in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as the art grant fund I established under the name EV. Trust, totaling $480,000. Silence, the kind of silence that isn't born from respect but from sheer disbelief. In the corner of the room, Alina blinked slowly. She didn't gasp, didn't smile, just listened. The lawyer continued. "Gregory left a note with this provision. It reads, 'Alina, for the years you gave me quietly, for the loyalty I took for granted, for the life you allowed me to build. You were never loud, but you were everything good. I hope this brings some measure of recognition. I'm sorry it took so long.'" And with that, the lawyer closed the folder. The room was frozen. Somewhere near the middle row, someone whispered, "She was his first wife, right?" Evelyn's mouth was tight. Her fingers gripped the armrest. One of her heels tapped the floor, slow and sharp. But Alina, she simply stood, no speech, no tears. She turned, walked past the marble pillars, past the shocked faces, past a world that had written her off, and stepped back into the light. She didn't need anyone's permission to reclaim her place in the story. The plane touched down in Charleston just after noon. Outside the window, sunlight painted the marshes gold, and the slow, winding rivers caught glints of sky as if they remembered how to dream. Alina Vance sat with her hands folded, her fingers brushing the edge of a manila folder tucked neatly into her handbag. 119 Crescent Lane. That was the address, the house left behind in Gregory's will. A place she'd never seen, never heard mentioned in the years they were married. And now it belonged to her. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Not gratitude, not quite anger, something quieter, a sort of pause inside her spirit. As if some part of her life had started speaking again after years of silence. The taxi driver, a talkative woman named Carla, chattered about weather and local bakery specials as they passed under wide trees and sun-soaked rooftops. Eleanor nodded politely, but her eyes were distant, fixed on the passing houses. Old porches, painted shutters, homes with history in the walls. When they finally pulled into the driveway of 119 Crescent Lane, Eleanor felt her breath catch, not for the size or the grandeur of the house, but for how strange it felt to belong somewhere again. The house was modest, a two-story white structure with black shutters and a creaking porch swing that swayed in the breeze. It wasn't imposing, it didn't scream wealth, it whispered. Carla helped unload the bag. "You sure you don't want me to wait?" she asked. "No," Eleanor said, offering a calm smile. "Thank you, but I need to go in alone." The key turned easily in the lock. The door opened without resistance. The air inside smelled like aged wood and linen. Dust curled in sunlight through the tall windows. Everything was still, no signs of recent life, yet it didn't feel abandoned. It felt preserved. She moved room by room, fingers trailing along bookshelves and curtain edges. The walls were painted soft blues and warm creams, a quiet elegance. The kitchen held a coffee pot that looked untouched. The living room, a large reading chair beside a fireplace with a basket of neatly stacked logs. It was intentional, as if someone had built it with her in mind. In the back hallway she found the study, a desk, a leather armchair. And in the top drawer a letter, her name written on the front in Gregory's handwriting. She sat before opening it. "Eleanor. If you are reading this, it means I'm no longer here, and the weight of explanation falls to paper instead of conversation. I bought this house in the second year of our marriage, though I never told you. I had dreams of it then. I imagined a place for us to visit, maybe even move into someday, away from city noise and ambition. But time changed things. I changed, and I didn't know how to bring you here once I had left you behind in every other way. This house was always meant for you. I kept it quietly like a memory I didn't want to lose completely. It isn't penance. It's acknowledgement. You gave me your years. This is one small return. Live here if you wish. Sell it if it brings you peace. But know that it was yours all along." She folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Later she stood on the back porch with a cup of tea she'd found in the cupboard. The yard stretched out into a gentle slope of wildflowers and pine. Birds passed overhead like scattered thoughts. It struck her then, for years she had lived in the shadow of being the former, the ex, the discarded, but this house had no shadows. It didn't ask who she had been. It simply offered space. In the following days, Eleanor stayed. She unpacked slowly. Read old novels from the shelves, walked into town and found the market. People were kind, curious but not invasive. She was just Miss Vance from the house on Crescent. She liked that. There was a freedom and anonymity. One afternoon, while organizing the study, she came across a second envelope. This one labeled EV Trust Disbursement Instructions. Inside were details for a charitable art grant fund, set up in her initials. Designed to support women over 50 pursuing artistic dreams they had once abandoned. She read the guidelines 3 times. It wasn't just money. It was a mission, a mirror of her, all those years teaching art, never painting. Encouraging others to create while her own canvases stayed folded in the back of closets. Gregory had seen that. At some point he had understood it. And now, through this, through funds bearing her name, he had given her the one thing he never had during their marriage. Validation. That night, Eleanor pulled out a box from her luggage. Inside were old sketchbooks. She laid them across the floor of the empty guest room and stared at them under the yellow light of a reading lamp. Lines, shapes. Hints of landscapes, the beginnings of stories told in charcoal. She opened a new page. For the first time in 20 years she began to draw, not for a gallery, not for Gregory, not for closure, just for herself. And in that quiet room, the house on Crescent Lane finally came alive. In the mornings, the house on Crescent Lane was a cathedral of light. Eleanor would rise early, often before the birds, before the neighborhood stirred. She liked it that way. The world, for a few brief hours, felt clean and untouched like a blank canvas. Fitting, she thought, considering what she was finally beginning to do. Painting had once been her secret language. In her 20s, before marriage, before Gregory, before lesson plans and fixed salaries, she had dreamed of galleries. Not for fame, for release. Her fingers always knew how to speak what her mouth couldn't. But then the years came, and with them, the practical decisions. The ones that closed doors with soft, invisible latches. Now, with the EV Trust documents spread across her desk, she found herself not only an artist again, but a benefactor. A curator of second chances. She reached out to the foundation contacts Gregory had worked with, names on the paperwork, emails buried in legal files. At first, they were cautious, curious. But when she explained her intentions to personally review applications, to mentor where she could, to build something with soul, they responded warmly. By the third week, she had 12 applications in her inbox, all from women. All over 50, all of them had a story. A woman who had been a nurse for 30 years and wanted to sculpt the faces of her lost patients from memory. A widow who had buried her dreams alongside her husband and now hoped to learn watercolors. A retired postal worker with a stack of poems no one had ever read. Elena read every word. She cried more than once. In them she saw pieces of herself, echoes, what-ifs, and more importantly, what-nows. One day, she received a handwritten letter from a woman named Nadine, age 61. It read, "I saw the ad for the EV Trust and thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone like me isn't who it was meant for. But then I saw your name. I remembered you. You taught at Willow Heights, didn't you? You helped me in 10th grade. I used to draw owls in your class and you told me they looked wise even when they were lopsided. I haven't drawn since I was 17. I want to start again. I want to feel like that girl in your classroom who believed maybe she had something to say." Elena held the letter to her chest. The world had moved on so quickly. It had replaced her, rebranded her, forgotten her. But here, in this quiet pocket of grace, she wasn't invisible. She mattered. She invited Nadine to visit Charleston. They met on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in the sunlit living room with tea and thick sketchpads between them. They didn't speak much at first. They didn't need to. Their silence was shared, familiar. By the end of the day, Elena had agreed to sponsor her materials, provide one-on-one mentorship, and help frame her first pieces. "It's not about the art," Nadine whispered as she left. "It's about remembering who I used to be." That night, Elena stared at her own reflection. She saw the lines around her eyes, the gray in her hair, but she didn't see loss. She saw return. It was near the end of October when the letter arrived. The envelope was thin, the handwriting elegant, slanted to the right, from Rebecca Langley, Gregory's daughter. She hadn't spoken to either of his children since the funeral. They were distant, cool, cloaked in the tension that came from knowing only part of a person's story. The letter was cautious, polite, and it ended with a question: "Would you be open to meeting? I have questions, not about the will, about you. About him, I want to understand." Elena folded the paper slowly. Her heart didn't leap, it ached. Because even now, all these years later, the past still reached for her, still asked her to explain the parts others chose not to see. She wrote back the next morning, "Yes, let's meet." They chose a cafe downtown. Public, neutral, warm wood tables and the smell of cinnamon. Rebecca arrived in a black coat, her hair in a sleek bun. She looked like Evelyn in the bone structure, but her eyes were searching. Not cold, curious. They ordered tea. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rebecca said, "He never talked about you, not really, just said it ended. Said he wished you well. I didn't know about the house, or the grant, or what you meant to him." Elena didn't smile, she just nodded. Sometimes people rewrite things to survive their own decisions. Rebecca looked down at her cup. "Do you hate him?" The question sat there, raw and open. Elena considered it. "No," she said finally. "I don't hate him, I don't miss him either. What I grieve is the years, the silence. But I also know that grief shaped me. And now I'm shaping what's next." Rebecca blinked. He left more of himself in that house than he did in ours. Elena reached for her bag, pulled out a thin booklet. "I'm curating a show," she said, "for the women I'm sponsoring. Their first one in the house, you're welcome to come." Rebecca didn't answer right away, but when she left, she took the booklet with her. A week later, Elena stood in the hallway of her home, watching as canvas after canvas was carefully arranged along the walls. There were sculptures, prints, handmade paper crafts. Music drifted from a speaker in the corner. Nadine stood near the kitchen, her hands trembling with joy. Other artists mingled quietly, their eyes wide with disbelief that they were being seen. It wasn't just an art show, it was a reclamation. And when Rebecca walked through the door, hesitant but present, Alina met her at the foyer with a quiet nod. No apologies, no explanations, just welcome. Because this chapter wasn't about Gregory, it was about the people who had learned to thrive in the quiet he left behind. It began with a mirror. Not just any mirror, but the one tucked into the back of the upstairs guest room, still covered in a thin white cloth. Alina hadn't noticed it in the first few weeks. The room had remained mostly untouched. But on a rainy Wednesday, when the wind knocked shutters against the side of the house, she wandered upstairs, carrying a mug of rooibos tea, and found herself standing before it. She pulled the cloth away slowly, and there she was, older, softer around the jawline, gray weaving its quiet path through her dark hair, lines around her eyes from years of squinting at blackboards, sunlight, and silence. Her hands looked the same, delicate, long-fingered, the hands of an artist, but they moved slower now, more thoughtful. She didn't flinch. She tilted her head and looked herself directly in the eye. And then she asked aloud, "When did I last paint a self-portrait?" The answer, of course, was never. She had painted still lifes. Nature, abstracts, landscapes, students, but never herself, not really, not truly. That afternoon, she set up a new easel in the library. The lighting was good there, soft, consistent. She chose oils instead of acrylics despite the mess. She wanted depth, texture, something that took time. Every day for the next week, she painted for 2 hours. She didn't aim for realism. She wasn't trying to reproduce her own image. She wanted emotion, truth, not beauty but presence. It surprised her how difficult it was. To see yourself, not just your face, but your choices, your doubts, your fears, and place them on canvas without apology. It required a kind of vulnerability she hadn't practiced in years. But as the colors layered, burnt umber, ochre, ultramarine, she began to feel something shift. By the 7th day, she stood back and looked at the finished work. The woman in the painting was not young, not glamorous, but she was vivid. Her eyes were clear, her jaw was set. There was history in her expression, but no shame. Alina didn't cry, she smiled. And that night she hung the portrait above the fireplace. The house began to change after that, not in structure, in energy. She opened the windows more, let in music, took to walking in the evenings, even if it was just a short loop around the neighborhood. The neighbors had started waving by name. A few came by with muffins. Someone left a handwritten note. "Welcome home, Miss Vance." She hosted another art evening, this time with twice the guests. Among them, a man named Harold Fields, who ran the local museum's education outreach program. He was in his late 60s. Wore cardigans with elbow patches, carried himself with a gentle curiosity. He stayed after the others had left. They spoke about everything but the past. Instead, they talked about art, local students, old jazz records. How hard it was to keep orchids alive. When he left, he said, "I hope this isn't too forward, but I'd love to take you out to dinner sometime. No agenda, just a meal with someone whose company I already know I enjoy." Alina blinked. She hadn't been asked that in years, and yet her answer came easily. "Yes, I'd like that." The first dinner was quiet, candlelit, filled with warm food and warm laughter. They shared stories of former jobs, embarrassing early mistakes, and secret dreams. Harold told her about the time he tried to start a bluegrass band in college and ended up breaking 3 violins. She told him about the student who once painted every desk in her classroom as part of a performance art piece. When they parted, he kissed her hand. It was tender, old-fashioned, and exactly enough. Over the following weeks, they became a quiet presence in each other's lives. No declarations, no expectations, just warmth. One morning, as Alina sliced apples in the kitchen, she paused. The sun poured through the window. Her favorite mug was warm in her hand. Music from the radio played low, and it hit her. She was happy, not dramatic joy, not movie scene happiness, but real, grounded peace. She hadn't chased it. It had grown here slowly in the soil of her own choosing. In early December, she received a letter. It was from Evelyn, the second wife. It was short. "Elena, I won't pretend we knew each other. I won't ask you to explain anything. But I found a painting in Gregory's office, an abstract one, all reds and golds. I never asked where it came from, but I see now that it was you. I hope the house has brought you something good. I hope the grant continues. I hope more than anything that we are both becoming someone we can respect. Evelyn. Alina read it twice, and then she placed it in the back of her sketchbook not as a souvenir but as a punctuation mark. A closing line to a chapter already ending. On the last day of the year, Alina hosted one final gathering. A celebration, not of Gregory, not of legacy, but of reinvention. Candles glowed, art hung in every hallway, new pieces. Old sketches, sculptures from Nadine, photographs from another recipient. Harold stood beside her as guests arrived, and when the music started, he offered her a dance. In the living room, surrounded by the echoes of a life once silenced, Alina Vance swayed gently to a soft piano tune, her eyes closed, her smile small but real. And somewhere in her heart, a voice whispered, "I am not what they left behind, I am what I chose to become." The attic had always been a quiet place. Even when she was a child, Alina had found peace in high places, rooms with sloped ceilings, boxes of forgotten things, and the smell of dust and wood beams. The attic in the Crescent Lane house was no exception. It was small but tidy, wooden shelves, one old trunk, a few labeled boxes, the kind of space made not to hold secrets, but to remind you they existed. It was late January. Charleston was crisp and dry, the sky pale blue and quiet. Alina had gone upstairs looking for a winter throw but stayed for something else. She found the box tucked behind a row of folded quilts. On the lid, a yellowed label read, "E. Vance Private." She hadn't packed it, she hadn't brought it from her apartment, which meant Gregory had. At some point years ago, he had taken her things, keepsakes from their life together, and stored them here. The irony wasn't lost on her. The things he couldn't make space for in their marriage, he made space for in a box. She opened it slowly. Inside were fragments. An old scarf she'd worn the first winter they'd lived in the city. Her favorite mug chipped but still intact. A dried flower from the bouquet she carried on their 10th anniversary. A sketchbook, and at the very bottom a sealed envelope, her handwriting. It was addressed to Gregory. She didn't remember writing it. Hands trembling, she unfolded the paper. It was dated 12 years ago, no stamp, never mailed. It read, "Gregory. I don't think I'm angry anymore. I don't think I even want answers. What I want is to feel like I existed. That I wasn't just a placeholder in someone else's journey. That the dinners I made, the holidays we shared, the birthdays I planned, they meant something even if they weren't spoken about after. I'm learning now that absence speaks as loudly as presence. You were in the room but never with me, and still I stayed. I stayed until I disappeared even to myself. But today I remembered my own voice. I picked up a pencil and drew something, nothing grand, just a lemon, but it looked alive. And so did I, so no, I don't need an apology. I just need to say this out loud once so I don't carry it any longer. I was here. And I mattered, Alina." She sat still for a long time, the silence wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Then, without ceremony, she folded the letter, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. She didn't need to burn it. She didn't need to send it, she had already lived it. The grant continued to grow, word spread, more women applied, and Alina began hosting monthly salons, small gatherings where artists shared their work, exchanged feedback, and told stories that had never found an audience before. At one of those evenings, a woman named June stood and read a short poem. It was called The After. It ended with the line, "I buried the version of myself who begged to be seen, and in her place grew a woman who no longer asks permission." The room went quiet. Someone whispered, "That's you, Alina." She smiled but didn't answer, because they were right. February brought soft rains. Alina took up gardening. She didn't know much. She read books, asked neighbors, watched videos online, planted herbs first. Basil, mint, then tomatoes, then roses. Each day she dug her hands into the earth and felt the steadiness of it. One afternoon, while pruning, she noticed something wedged under a stepping stone by the porch. An old key, rusty, ornate. Not labeled. She brought it inside, rinsed it gently, and stared. She remembered Gregory once talking about a safety deposit box in Charleston. He had mentioned it in passing years ago after a trip. She had barely noticed then. Now she wondered. The next morning she visited the bank listed on the key's tag. The clerk was surprised but cooperative. With her ID and Gregory's death certificate, the process was slow but permitted. Inside the box were 3 things. A folded envelope, a velvet pouch, and a photograph. The photo was old, black and white. A young Alina standing in front of her first classroom, chalk in hand, smiling. She didn't remember him taking it. The velvet pouch held a pendant, a simple silver locket with a tiny sketch etched inside her lemon drawing. He had kept it, and the envelope just one sentence. Some things I was too cowardly to say out loud. There was no signature, no apology, no excuses, and somehow it was enough. She walked home slowly that day, the locket in her coat pocket, the photograph tucked safely inside her journal. That evening, she added a new self-portrait to the wall. This one was different. She painted herself walking through an open field, the wind pulling at her coat, her face turned toward something unseen, not running, not arriving, just moving forward. Spring arrived like a song she remembered from childhood, soft, surprising, and somehow familiar even after so much silence. The yard bloomed early that year. Tulips pushed through the soil like hopeful hands, and birds returned to the old tree beside the porch, building new homes where no nests had rested in years. Alina woke each day to the scent of morning rain, the light through the linen curtains, and the knowledge that her life now answered only to her. She didn't think often of Gregory anymore, not with pain, not even with longing. He became, as all things eventually do, a chapter finished, shelved, and closed without bitterness. What remained was the story she was still writing. The EV Trust had grown. What began as a personal grant now supported over 40 women across 3 states. Alina had partnered with local galleries, hosted workshops, and even launched a small scholarship for adult learners returning to art school. But it wasn't the numbers that moved her, it was the emails, the letters, the way strangers became creators again, lives reignited because someone had whispered, "You still matter." Harold, too, remained a quiet presence in her world. They never moved in together, they didn't speak of starting over. They simply shared what already was: walks after dinner, conversations on the porch, the comfort of knowing someone else was in the room who understood the value of silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the magnolia trees hummed with bees, Harold turned to her. "You've changed this place," he said. Alina raised an eyebrow. "The house." He shook his head. "No, the air around it." She laughed gently. "That's just gardening and clean windows." "No," he said, "it's something else. You've made it a home for more than just you." She didn't answer. But later, when she stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at the framed sketches on the walls, the letters pinned to the corkboard by the front door, the shelves filled with art and books and life, she understood what he meant. The house had become a reflection of her, not of who she had been with Gregory, but of who she had always been becoming. In early May, Alina received a package. There was no return address. Inside was a small canvas. The painting was of a window, a familiar one, her living room window from the outside looking in. At the center was a figure, her, seated at a table sketching, peaceful, alone, surrounded by light, no signature, just a card tucked behind it. "You taught me that being seen doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just takes staying." She didn't need to know who had sent it. She knew. By summer, the house on Crescent Lane had become something of a landmark in the local art scene. Young artists passed it like a secret. They whispered about Miss Vance's place, a house where stories were told not through words, but through strokes of color and moments of quiet courage. One evening, as she cleaned brushes in the kitchen sink, she noticed a small group of students standing at the gate, sketchpads in hand. She stepped outside. "Would you like to come in?" They nodded. She led them to the back room where she had turned an old sunroom into an open studio. There were supplies for everyone. Music, lemonade in glass pitchers, no rules, just space. That became their ritual, Tuesdays at Crescent Lane. Some of them came shyly, others came with fire, but all of them left different. In Alina, she watched them grow, and in watching, she bloomed too. On the 1-year anniversary of the Grant's founding, Alina stood in the center of her living room, now transformed into a gallery once more, and gave a short speech. Not rehearsed, not grand, just truth. "I once believed I had lived a life that was forgotten, that my quietness had made me invisible, but I was wrong. What I've learned, what all of you have shown me, is that presence does not require noise. Legacy doesn't need applause. In love, the kind that outlives disappointment, it's found in what we build quietly every day with intention." The room was silent, and then it was full of applause, but that wasn't what stayed with her. What stayed was the moment afterward when a young woman, no older than Alina had been when she first married, approached her. With tears in her eyes, she said, "You reminded me that it's never too late to begin." That night, long after the guests had gone and the music had faded, Alina sat by the fireplace. The room glowed. On the wall above her hung the self-portrait, the first one. To its right, a second portrait, one she had finished only weeks earlier. In it she was laughing, eyes closed, head thrown slightly back. Hair pulled by the wind, free. She stared at it for a long time, then she whispered, "I see you now." The world had once known her as someone's wife, someone's ex. Someone who had been left behind, but not anymore. Now she was someone's mentor, someone's hope, someone's lighthouse, and most importantly, she was hers, Alina Vance, artist, teacher, builder of lives, writer.